All right, welcome to our lecture on the peripheral nervous system. So this lecture is going to primarily focus on the aspects of our peripheral nervous system and mainly looking at our cranial nerves. So we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. We have 24 in total. And then we will take a look at our spinal nerves as well, and we'll look at some anatomy of the spinal cord and spinal nerves and some major nerves going out to our periphery. We will also talk about some of these things with our senses lecture. So the senses are a component of our peripheral nervous system, and so some of the cranial nerves and things we will touch on here, but we may go into slightly more detail with our senses lecture. So we will review that the nervous system can be divided into two parts, central and peripheral. In the last lecture, we talked about the central nervous system being the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is essentially everything else, which is going to include our cranial nerves and our spinal nerves. So our cranial nerves, we're going to have 12 pair, but 24 in total. So understand for every cranial nerve, there is a left and a right. They will be denoted as and represented by Roman numerals. So you should at least know the first 12 Roman numerals when learning the cranial nerves. So they're all written in sequential order, and again, up to 12. All of these are going to arise off the brain or brainstem, so we'll see that the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve are kind of unique in that they don't necessarily arise directly from the brainstem, but many of our others will. So different components around the midbrain, around the pons, around the medulla oblongata, will these nerves arise. When you look at the skull and you study the osteology of the skull, and you look at the bones and you look at all the foramen, all of those foramen and all those openings, those holes, they're there for a purpose. They're there to allow nerves and arteries and veins to pass through them as they're going from one area of the brain to another area. So we have different ones like the foramen magnum, which is the large hole at the base of the brain. We have small ones like the foramen spinosum, foramen rotundum, ovale. We have optic canals, and we'll take a look at all these as our nerves run in and out of those foramina. And one last thing to note about our cranial nerves is that they will either be sensory, they will be motor, or they will be mixed. And so what this means is that it is one individual nerve is either going to contain purely sensory fibers or sensory neurons, meaning that they are leaving the central nervous system going out towards the periphery. So afferent signals. It is going to be either motor, meaning that it is completely efferent. This is signals coming out and going. I'm sorry, I think I misspoke a second ago. Our sensory fibers are afferent, like I said, but they're going to the central nervous system. Okay, they're arriving at the central nervous system. Our motor are efferent. They are leaving or exiting the central nervous system to go out to some tissue. And then mixed can be nerves that contain both sensory and motor fibers. So there'll be mixed nerves. And there are mnemonics. To remember this, the mnemonic I use is some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter more. If you look at each of these words, some say money matters, that means that the first four cranial nerves are sensory, some say, and then money matters is motor. Okay, so you can look at that and you can see which specific cranial nerves are either sensory, mixed, or both. So we have the base of our brain look something like this, and this is what you typically see in lab. You see in models, you see a depiction of the cranial nerves like this, and they're oftentimes highlighted in yellow or they're numbered to indicate what their number is. But in reality, our cranial nerves are much more complex than these short little nubs that we see coming off different components of the brain. So we have pathways that look something like this. So this is a pathway of our facial nerve or cranial nerve 7 as it traverses the internal acoustic meatus, and it will go out and give off all these little branches. We have ones like this that is representative of the trigeminal nerve here with its three main branches, ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular. And we have things that look like this with our pathways of our optic nerve or cranial nerve 2. And we'll take a look at this, and we'll also take a look at this when we get to our senses lecture, where we'll go into more detail on this. So understand that Yes, learning the cranial nerves like this is great. It's how you initially learn them, look at where they're coming from, and then a general sense of where they're going. But understand that you have these very complicated branching networks of nerves as they go throughout the skull. So here are some pertinent foramina, some important ones that we'll see, and there are lots of others. So we have stylomastoid foramen in between the mastoid process and the styloid process. We have a foramen spinosum and ovale. There would also be a foramen rotundum right here next to it. We can see jugular foramen. We can see foramen lacerum, optic canals. There are lots of these openings, these foramina. And again, these are just for allowing nerves to enter and exit different parts of the skull. So we will start by talking about our first cranial nerve. So as we get to these, I want you to think about their name, so olfactory. I want you to think about what number it is, so cranial nerve 1, and remember in terms of Roman numerals. And then I want you to associate it as either being sensory, motor, or both. And then we'll go into more detail on its sensory, motor function, or if it's both, we'll talk about both of them. Okay? So our cranial nerve 1 is our olfactory nerve. It is purely sensory for our special sense of smell. Okay, so we'll talk about special senses, and we've talked about general senses. General senses are things like pain, temperature, pressure, touch, things like that. Our special senses are those that have a dedicated organ to them. So our sense of smell, our sense of taste, our sense of equilibrium, hearing, smell, all these different vision, all these different things. These are special senses. Okay, so cranial nerve 1. What you're going to have is at the roof of your nose, within your nasal cavity, you will have a nasal epithelium, and it's lined by mucosa. It's lined by this epithelial tissue. Embedded within that epithelial tissue, we have these small little fibers known as fila olfactoria, and these fila olfactoria are the actual nerve fibers of the cranial nerve 1. As you go from these fila olfactoria back to the brain after they have detected stimuli, you pass through a region known as the cribriform plate, which, if you recall from reviewing the skeleton, is part of your ethmoid bone, and they go to the olfactory bulb. Okay, from the olfactory bulb, we will continue posteriorly toward the brain, so toward the cerebrum, and it will be known as the the olfactory tracts. Okay, now if we take a look here. Here we can see olfactory bulbs and tracts. And so these are technically not the nerve. This is technically not the olfactory nerve. This is the olfactory bulb and tract. And when we look here we can see the actual nerve fibers traversing this cribriform plate, these cribriform foramina, into your nasal epithelium, okay, your nasal mucosa. Okay, so for naming purposes, this is fine to call this olfactory nerve cranial nerve 1 olfactory nerve, because this is all you can see from a dissection standpoint. But understand that this is technically the bulb and the tract, and you have the fila olfactoria, the actual nerve fibers, coming off of that. So here's your bulb, and here are the fibers coming down. As you inhale something, air around you, that air will enter into your nasal cavity, and there will be little chemicals in the air that will stimulate these receptors down here to send action potentials up the olfactory fibers to the bulb, to the tract, and ultimately all the way back to the brain. So here's a lateral view of what we see. So here's our cribriform plate, right? Cribriform plate, our olfactory bulb, and then perforating that cribriform plate, those cribriform foramina, into your olfactory mucosa, or all of your individual olfactory nerves. Okay, so our second cranial nerve is going to be known as our optic. So again, optic, this is going to be a purely sensory nerve for our special sense of vision. And this will be a nerve that we look at a lot when we get to our senses lecture. Okay, so it is sensory for vision. I think we all understand that, given the name optic. But how does it do that? So what we're going to have is at the posterior aspect of the eye, you have the innermost lining of the eye, which is known as the retina, this thin sheet. And if you dissect an eye, a sheep eye or a cow eye or something, you can actually kind of peel this. It appears yellow. You can kind of peel this retina away from the underlying choroid. Now, there's a region of the retina where it begins to exit the eye as the optic disc. And the optic disc is going to be our quote-unquote blind spot. You may have heard of that. All that means is it is void of, meaning that it lacks our photoreceptors, so our rods and our cones. And we'll talk about rods and cones, and we'll talk about photoreceptors in general, and we'll talk about this optic disc more when we get to our senses lecture. Now, as we leave the eye at the retina, you become the optic disc, then you become your optic nerve. Now, there is an area where the optic nerve from the left eye and the optic nerve from the right eye meet and they cross. Now, this is called the optic chiasm or the optic chiasma. The Greek letter chi is shaped like an X. Okay, so this X, when you see it, this crossing, this chiasm, when you look at it on the brain, you actually see where these things are crossing. Okay, after you've become your nerve and you cross at the chiasm, you then refer to it as tracks. Okay, so an important thing to note though, at the chiasm, some fibers cross at the chiasm and some don't. Some stay on the same side. So your right side of your brain is actually receiving visual stimuli and visual information from both left and right eyes. Okay, same goes with the left side of your brain. It is receiving visual information from both left and right eyes, and we'll take a closer look at this pathway. Now, you have this information relayed to your occipital lobe, so that's the anatomy, that's the structure, and the functional area within your occipital lobe is your primary visual cortex, where you're receiving information, you're processing it, and then you can have visual association areas where you begin to associate what you are seeing with past memories or past information. And then you have a region known as the superior colliculi or superior colliculus. You have two superior colliculi and you have two inferior colliculi. Together, these four colliculi make up something known as the corpora quadrigemina, which means the four-bodied twin or four-bodied sisters. You see it whenever you kind of pull the cerebellum away from the occipital lobe. You can see it a little bit better in a sheep brain, in a sheep specimen. But what these superior colliculi are doing are they're allowing us to coordinate our visual responses to things. So imagine you're sitting somewhere, you're looking somewhere, and something moves quickly out of and you see it in your peripheral vision. The superior colliculi are involved with orienting and turning your eyes toward that visual stimulus. Okay, so here we can see our optic nerve. You can see where it makes this X, this optic chiasm here, and then you become optic tracks posterior to that as you're working your way towards your occipital lobe. You can also note the pituitary gland here, and so you can see the proximity of the pituitary gland to your optic chiasm. So there are instances in which people can develop a pituitary tumor, and you can imagine if you have a tumor or this growth on the pituitary and it begins to impede and put pressure on your optic chiasm, what is that going to impact? Well, it's going to impact your sense of vision. Okay, so you may see, you may have some visual deficits or some visual effects if somebody had a pituitary tumor affecting their optic chiasm. So this is the pathway of the optic nerve, so cranial nerve 2, and we'll look at this again when we talk about our senses. One thing to keep in mind, and the main thing you should note, is that fibers, so you can divide your retina into two parts. You can have a temporal and a nasal, temporal being more lateral and nasal being more medial, closer to your nose. And then you have two visual fields. So you have a kind of more medial visual field and you have a lateral visual field for both eyes. Fibers that are stimulating stimuli that is stimulating your temporal retina for either eye, left or right, will stay on the same side of the brain. So if it stimulates your temporal retina or information coming to your temporal retina will stay on that same side for your left eye. If it's stimulating the right temporal retina of your right eye, it's going to stay on the right side of the brain. Okay, so if it's stimulating the temporal retina, it'll stay on the same side. If it's stimulating the nasal retina, it's going to cross over. Okay, so if we take a look here, if this is a superior view and we're looking down, here's our temporal retina. Here we're going to come And instead of crossing, we're going to stay on the same side. And if we take a look at our nasal retina, here we're going to be stimulated, go along our optic nerve chiasm, and here we're going to cross over to the opposite side. Okay. Now, your retina, whether it's temporal or nasal, remember I said temporal is more lateral, nasal is more medial, it will receive and be stimulated from kind of its opposite visual field. So what I mean here is that your temporal retina, which is more lateral, is going to be stimulated by information from your more medial visual field. Okay. Your nasal retina which is more medial, is going to be stimulated by information from your more lateral visual field. Okay, so you can imagine kind of doing this cross here. If it's medial visual field, it's going to cross and hit your temporal retina. If it's lateral visual field, it's going to hit your more nasal retina or more medially located retina. Okay, and then you have information coming over here. So if you know this pathway, you can then kind of make an assumption of, well, what may happen if I have damage to the optic nerve, if I have it to the optic chiasm, or if I have damage to the optic tract. Okay, so if you have damage to your optic nerve itself, so say an optic nerve was severed, you lose total vision in that one eye. Okay, so you can imagine here we're receiving information, here we're receiving it. Well, if we completely sever this optic nerve on this left side, well, we have no longer we no longer have the ability to transmit that information to the brain. Okay, so you lose complete vision. If you damage your chiasm, okay, so damage your chiasm, follow it out. So say you damage this red fiber and this blue fiber, follow it out. Well, here we've lost this more lateral field of view, and if we follow this one out to this nasal retina, we've lost this more lateral field of view. So what you get here, if you damage the chiasm, the complete chiasm, you get tunnel vision, essentially. You lose your peripheral vision. Now, if you damage your optic tract, this will be the last one we take a look at. If you damage your optic tract, again, that's information to both eyes. Nerve was just one eye. Chiasm, you're affecting both eyes. Tract, you're affecting both eyes. So say we damage this right one right here. Let's follow it out. So if we damage this, we're losing these fibers here. So we've lost this medial visual field here. If we follow this one out, here we've lost our more lateral visual field. Okay. But what you can say is you've lost the same side or the same visual field in both eyes. So here you lost, if you're talking about this right eye, here you've lost your left aspect of your visual field. And here when you come over, you've lost the left aspect of this one. Here it was the more medial visual field. Here it was the more lateral. And what this is called is homogeneous hemianopsia. Okay, so that's a big word, homogeneous hemianopsia. Homogeneous meaning you've lost the same, the prefix homo means same, so you've lost the same visual fields in both eyes. Okay, what that means is here you've lost the more, and what I mean when I say the same visual field, I don't mean lateral in both or medial in both. I mean here associated with this right eye, you lost the left aspect of your vision. Here on the other eye, you've also lost the left aspect of your vision. Okay, so you end up with, so imagine if you're looking straight ahead or you're looking at the screen and focus on your left eye, everything in the peripheral vision of your left eye, you've lost. And if you're talking about your right eye, everything in your more medial half of your vision for your right eye has been lost. So you've lost the same visual field in both eyes, and that is called homogeneous hemianopsia. And again, you can see this information is making its way all the way back here to our primary visual cortex of our occipital lobe. So we'll stop there and we'll pick up with cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, in the next part.